We are gonna, the next movie we're watching after The Thin Red Line is Since You Went Away, which is it's mostly, well, it's basically about this family, and the dad is mobilized and goes off to fight in the war, and it's about how the mother and the two daughters deal with the home front situation, and it brings up all the issues of, you know, how can middle-class women maintain their femininity if they're working in a factory, and do we have to work in a factory, and what's our duty as women towards the war effort, etc. And it was made by a Hollywood studio, and it won a bunch of Oscars. So it was high production quality. It includes the obligatory racism towards Japanese people, but it was made with the explicit help of the Department of Defense, and it is clearly a propaganda film. Now, it's a soft-pedaled propaganda film in the sense that it's not like
Top Gun.
Yeah, I mean it's a pretty good story, and it's a well-made film, and the acting is good, and it's an interesting story. It's not overtly, but it's clearly a propaganda film in another sense. I mean, you get to the end of it like, oh yeah, that was a propaganda film, right? It does star Shirley Temple.
Yes. My angel!
Yeah, she's getting old though. She's like teenager in this one.
Oh my god!
Okay, so let me talk about women in World War II. There are a lot of similarities between World War I and World War II in the sense that they're both total wars, and so countries in both wars had to organize their economy around war production, and simultaneously send millions of men off to fight. And so to do that, they naturally drew women who weren't working into the workforce. Now, I want to make one thing clear. The Germans, the Nazis, were patriarchal enough that they absolutely positively refused to bring German women into the workforce. Now, there were German working class women who were already in the workforce, but the Nazis made absolutely zero effort to mobilize women who were not in the workforce to join the workforce because they didn't think women belonged in the workforce. Right? The Nazis thought the place for women was Kinderkirche, Küche, which is kitchen, kids' kitchen and church. Right? And so the Nazis refused, and instead what they did was they used slave labor. All of those concentration camps filled Jews and Russian POWs and Polish POWs, and then when they conquered France and Holland, etc., they requisitioned young men to go from those countries and had to go work in factories, live in camps. They weren't as bad as the concentration camps, but live in camps in Germany, working in factories, etc. So the Germans tried to solve the problem by just stealing men from other countries, right? And stealing Jewish women or Russian women or Polish women they didn't think they had to respect, they could bring into the workforce, right? But they did not bring middle-class German women into the workforce. But France, the United States, Great Britain, etc., all brought women into the workforce in significant numbers. It was similar to World War I in that the United States in particular made a serious effort to convince middle-class American women to take up jobs in defense industries, etc. This is Rosie the Riveter, etc. All the propaganda posters, etc. And so in that sense, I'm not going to go over all the details. I can give you that. I think I can give you numbers next time. But a lot of women entered the workforce. I'll just say that. And there was a consistent effort, especially in England and the United States, to bring middle-class women into the workforce, convince them to go get a job. Any questions about that? As a side note, I will also mention that World War II in the United States was a key part of the migration of African-American communities out of the Deep South, because they suddenly found that war industries were concentrated in cities like Detroit and Chicago and Cleveland up in the north, big industrial cities, Pittsburgh, or in California, because of the supplying the Pacific, et cetera. And so you saw a massive migration of African Americans from the South to both the northern, what we would now call Rust Belt cities, or to California. to work in war industries because they suddenly could get jobs they couldn't get before because of racism. Now there was a desperate enough need for workers that they would take African American.
I kind of have two questions. One is like, did women want to work?
Generally, no. And the movie really hits this. I mean, the movie really focuses on the mother in particular is torn. Because on the one level, she feels like going to work in a factory is completely bankrupting all of her respectability as a female, as a middle-class female, because middle-class women don't work in factories. She's failing as a woman if she goes to work in a factory. But on the other hand, with her husband off in the military, he was an advertising executive in normal life, and now he's called up in the reserves, and he's not making nearly as much money, and so the family needs money desperately. So, does she have to do it? That's the sort of question she's wrestling with.
Yeah, and I guess like the other part of my question would be like, what happened to like domestic labor, like who took care of the kids and stuff?
This film's answer is African American women.
Okay.
I don't think, it's interesting. It's a Southern phenomenon. It's not completely all over the U.S., but my generation does not have much of a memory of having African American women as housekeepers raising the kids. But the generation before us, that was totally common. that was a common job for African American women, and so white families would invite the one woman into the family to be the caretaker for the kids, etc., and really was sort of a mother figure for the kids in a lot of ways. And my wife actually had that exact situation growing up. She was from Missouri, and so she remembers that exact situation. But I don't think it was that common outside of the South. But it could have been, I'm not sure.
Okay.
But that really all entirely stopped with the civil rights movement. That's like, that sort of class structure based on race is just not going to fly anymore. So. Any other questions on that? All right, so women enter the workforce, but World War II, as I mentioned already, World War II had several ways in which women found themselves in combat in new ways that never happened in World War I. And the biggest thing is, of course, bombing. And the Americans and the British are the ones who did the most of this. The Germans in the Battle of Britain did bomb London heavily and killed thousands of women. They bombed cities like Coventry and other cities in England hard and caused massive destruction and lots of civilian deaths, men and women and children, etc. But the really horrific bombing was done by the Americans and the British. They did massive bombing campaigns on Northern Europe, and then as the bombers got better, they extended that farther and farther, and they were even bombing as far away as Romania. And you look concerned about Romania.
No, I just don't draw the map. I was like,
Oh.
what color was Romania? I know where it is. I'm just not sure.
Okay.
I just can't remember what they were up to during.
Romania had a bunch of oil fields, named the Ploesti oil fields, and the Americans, after they had conquered North Africa, they couldn't fly from London or from England to Romania and bomb it and get back. They didn't have enough gas, but they could fly from England to Romania to North Africa, which now is held, and so they did that. And in fact, I think I've mentioned my first wife's father was a World War II veteran, and he did that raid and got shot down over Yugoslavia trying to get to North Africa. The bombing of especially German cities, and I mean, I don't want it to make it sound like only the Americans and British did it, because I mean, the Germans at the beginning of the war bombed Rotterdam, which is in Holland, and they wiped it off the map. I mean, they destroyed the whole city and caused thousands and thousands of casualties. But the really horrific bombings were carried out by mostly the Americans, but also the British, in Germany and in Japan. I don't think most people, I mean, we all heard about the nuclear warheads dropped on, the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but we firebombed Tokyo, which, firebombing is, everyone know what firebombing is? You have bombs that are not really explosive, but what they have is chemicals in them. When they come in contact with oxygen, burn. And so basically you're dropping these bombs to splatter chemicals that burn. And it's a chemical fire, so actually water usually doesn't put it out. And so what you're doing is you're trying to start fires. And in firebombing, you can start what's called a firestorm, which is where you have so many fires burning in the center of a city that you have this column of hot air rising, and it causes air to come rushing in from all directions to replace the rising air. And the city of Hamburg got firebombed in 1943 by the British. The Americans took part in that too. They had winds of hurricane force winds, over 120 mile an hour winds coming into Hamburg from all directions because there's such a column of flames rising from the center of the city. And if one of these bombs landed near you and splattered you, you got chemicals all over you that stuck all over you that burned, and they don't get put out with water or anything. You have to, if you jump underwater so there's no oxygen, it'll stop burning, but when you get back out of the water, it starts burning again.
Don't wash off, they like stick to your skin.
Yeah, and you have to get it off with other chemicals. And so in Hamburg, for instance, they firebombed Hamburg. It was a big industrial city in northern Germany. They firebombed Hamburg in one night, killed about 30,000 people. The temperatures in the center of the city, the asphalt streets melted. There's some estimates that the temperature at street level hit 1,200 degrees all over the center of the city. People in bomb shelters died because the bomb shelters underground got so hot that they baked. Someone estimated that in the center of the city, the bomb shelters were hitting 600 degrees inside, and whole trees were getting ripped out of the ground by the winds blowing into the center of the city and just being thrown into the flames. And of course, people who got splattered with the chemicals jumped in the river to put out the fire, and they found that they couldn't get out of the river. It started burning again, and most of them drowned because they wound up just standing in the river until they got so exhausted they collapsed and drowned because they couldn't get out of the river without bursting into flames again. Absolutely horrific. We firebombed Tokyo, and we dropped the atomic bombs in August of 1945 on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We firebombed Tokyo several times earlier in 1945, and on one night, I think it was in March, we caused over 100,000 deaths, which is more than Hiroshima and Nagasaki together by burning Tokyo. We just firebombed it. And the city of Dresden got wiped off the map in the famous firebombing, which, if you ever read Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, he was there. And then we just had massive bombing campaigns, just dropping tons and tons of bombs on Berlin or Dusseldorf or any other industrial city. And in fact, by the end of the war, the Germans were actually digging massive caverns underground to build factories underground, which is hugely wasteful, but they had slave labor and they didn't care, and they killed thousands of people building these caverns to put in a factory, and 2 months before the end of the war. But all of this meant that women were, in many ways, intentional victims of the war. Everybody knew that if you're bombing a city, you're going to be killing women and children. But that was seen as essentially fair game. Now, according to the Geneva Convention, it's a war crime because you're not supposed to target civilians. The Americans and British said, we're not targeting civilians, we're targeting factories, but the damn bombs just go everywhere and kill people. They said, they're basically saying it's a big accident. But firebombing Hamburg is not an accident. That doesn't happen by accident.
Yeah.
And that when you set the entire center of the city on fire.
Turning a city into a flaming hurricane essentially is not accidental.
Yes. So women were the intentional targets, really. And part of this was that it was a recognition of the nature of a total war. Because in a total war, the nation that can continue to produce weapons and soldiers and keep its economy running even while it's supplying an army, the nation that can outlast the others wins the war. And so women are actually incredibly crucial for the war effort. And the Pierre-Drew LaRochelle reading we had in Comedy of Charleroi, he complained that World War I was a war of factories and women and children, et cetera. And what he's getting at is this is a total war. It wasn't decided solely by men on the battlefield. It was decided by the factories back in Paris or in Berlin, et cetera. And in World War II, they took that to the logical conclusion and said, we need to kill women who are working in the armaments factories to cripple their armaments ability, right? And so in World War II, women were targeted in a way they never were in World War I. And the number of women who died in World War II was in the millions. The number of people who died in World War II was huge. The estimates are all over the map, and they're still figuring out that the death toll in China was higher than they thought. They're still finding millions of people in China who died in World War II. Not the actual bodies, but the records. But at the very least, World War II killed 55 million.
Are like people, like Japanese people who were affected by radiation, like counted in all,
Yeah.
like in those numbers?
Yeah,
Like,
if they
who didn't
well,
die?
if I don't, I mean, different historians have different numbers, but generally they do include people who died of thyroid poisoning because
Yeah,
they were in
'cause
Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
I imagine like an area around Hiroshima and Nagasaki were somewhat dangerously irradiated for some time following
Yes.
the war, if not like
Yeah,
still irradiated to this day.
yeah, they're not too radioactive today, but the cancer rates were sky high for a decade at least after that. Any questions about that? The one other big, one other thing that I mentioned before is that World War II being a war of motion, you've got tanks, you've got airplanes, you've got motorized columns, you've got jeeps, etc. And we saw this in, Saving Private Ryan with the airplanes and the tanks and all that. It becomes a war of motion, and in Saving Private Ryan, you had that family caught in the middle of the war zone, right? And they're just trapped there in the middle of fighting. And so lots of women and children and old men, etc., also died because it was war of motion, and they simply, they're wherever they were, got taken over by combat briefly, but lots of people died while that combat happened.
Was the so women in like Europe and Japan, were they having a much different relationship with this war than American women? Because
Oh, absolutely.
it would seem for American women the largest change was just that they had to enter the workforce. But
Rationing was big too.
Yeah, but it doesn't seem like American women's death toll was really
No.
as high as any other place.
No, I mean there were women nurses, and there were. I'll get into this in a minute. Women did play a much bigger role in the military, in fact, of these, but they were never in combat roles, intentional combat roles. So the death toll was much lower for women in the army, et cetera. And American women did not. I mean, there were a couple of places. The only time the United States got attacked in World War II was, Pearl Harbor was not part of the United States. Hawaii was an American territory, but Hawaii didn't become a state until the 1950s. And Attu and Kiska and some other Aleutian islands in Alaska got taken by the Japanese, but that was also not a U.S. state yet. That became a state in the 50s.
Yes.
The only U.S. state that actually saw anything approaching combat was that a Japanese submarine surfaced off the coast of Oregon and lobbed a couple of shells into the coast of Oregon one day. And didn't kill anybody. So there was no fighting on American soil. Now, there were industrial accidents and things like that. If you work in the ammunition factory, accidents happen.
Yeah, especially if you're working with ammunition.
Yeah. And they quickly discovered that the best screwing the final firing fuses onto artillery shells, women's hands were better sized for that, so they only used women for that. And that's...
Oh, the part where if you screwed a little too much, it just hits the pin and everything goes wrong.
Yes, exactly.
Did the Japanese submarine have targets, or did it just
No, it was just entirely simple.
Taking pot shots at the coast of Oregon.
It was a tiny gun. It wasn't even I think it was an anti-aircraft gun or something. It was not, it was just to say to the Americans, you're not safe.
It just, you hit a beach and
No, it just surfaced, 200 yards offshore and just fired a couple of rounds and went under and
They said, "Hey, look, that's America over there.
yeah.
Show who's boss."
The one other thing I will mention is World War II really was a global war. There was actual fighting all across the Pacific. The women, it wasn't just women from the countries who were the combatants. You had Indian women affected by the war, and you had Burmese women, and Chinese women, and Japanese women, and Filipino women, and Indonesian women, etc. And you had Belgian and Dutch and Danish and Norwegian, etc. So the fact that the war had a much bigger scope meant that more women were by nature included in the conflict. The one place that the Anglo-American country, the Britain and the United States, were different than the rest is that both of them had experimented in World War I with the idea of including women in the military and auxiliaries. In World War II, they dramatically upped that. And so you had a whole series of organizations, branches of the military, auxiliaries for the military, that were created during World War II for women. The most famous is the WACS, the Women's Army Air Corps. But in England, they had the Wrens, which is the Women's Royal Naval Service. I don't know where the E comes from, but
To make the acronym sound like a bird.
yes. And there were WAVES, which is the Women's Auxiliary Volunteer Service for the Navy, and these were uniform services. You were actually in the military. You took an oath, you got paid, you wore a uniform, etc. And we'll see, I think, in some future readings. I think I assigned that this semester that there's a lot of controversy about the uniforms for women because uniforms are seen as masculine, and how do you make the uniforms feminine enough but still make them uniforms? And does even putting a woman in a uniform dishonor the soldiers, the male soldiers, by making a mockery of masculinity and etc.
Yeah. Those pantsuits, those skirt suits are really
Yeah, they're skirt suits.
Make a mockery of the soldiers.
So just to give you some numbers really quick, there were 57,000 women in the U.S. Army. There were 11,000 Navy nurses. There were 100,000 women in the Women's Army Air Corps, so 100,000 WACs. There were 86,000 WAVES, which is the Women's Auxiliary, is the Naval Auxiliary. And there were 1,800 women in the Marines, and there were 11,000 women in SPARS, which is the Coast Guard Reserve. So they hired women they brought women into the Coast Guard to do jobs that men had done in the past. Now that's not, that's 250,000, et cetera, but that's 250,000 more than in World War I. Any questions about that?
So you said that there was nurses, and mostly it was support role, right? It was
Yes.
mostly focused into logistics roles.
Yes, it was mostly clerical work. They just simply freed up men from typing reports or sending out orders, et cetera, by having women do it. There were some serious, I don't want to say clerical work is not serious, but there were some semi-military roles. For instance, if you look at the syllabus, there's a picture of a bunch of women in an air crew walking away from a bomber. To save male pilots, they drafted women's pilots into the WACs, and when they produced a B-17 in the United States and it had to make its way to the Pacific, they had female pilots fly them there. These were non-combat missions because you were not going into the combat zone, you were just dropping them off in Hawaii or something. But somebody had to fly those planes, and women did that, and there were a number of casualties because planes crash, etc. And so there were significant numbers of female pilots, and as the Gubar report points out, they often didn't know what to do with women who actually had military skills. They pointed out there was a woman, Gubar pointed out the woman who volunteered for the U.S. Army, and she was a professional paratrooper. Her job before the war had been, she did air shows where she would jump from one airplane to another in midair. She had set the world record for the highest parachute jump ever. And they said, "Oh, great, you know parachuting." So what they have her do, not training paratroopers, they had her just packing parachutes over and over again for the entire war. And then there was another war. She was a reporter before the war, and she had spent significant time in Japan. She spoke fluent Japanese. She understood Japanese culture. She volunteers for the army and says, "I've got all these skills. I can help you do intelligence work, etc." They made her a cook because she was a woman. So the army didn't know what to do with women often, but they did use women for roles that they deemed to be suitable for women, which usually meant clerical work or cooking or nursing work. So those are extensions of traditional women's roles, but there were also things like female pilots and working in ammunition factories, which were not at all traditional female.
Did they not even use women in their like intelligence apparatus? Like
They did. I mean, there were certainly female clerks, like Bletchley Park was the British code-breaking operation, and they had female clerks and even some female computers there. So they did use women for roles in there and intelligence gathering, et cetera. But they did not, they shied heavily away from using women as spies.
Yeah.
The French resistance would do that, but they weren't a
it was
branch of the
like
government.
Just a resistance movement.
Yeah.
They're doing a lot of crazy stuff.
Yeah. Other questions, comments? All right, let's take a 5-minute break and we'll continue with Thin Red Line.